Lorayne Woodend. I work as a planning policy officer up in Kendal in Cumbria. The work that I'm going to talk about isn't actually something I've done as part of my job, but it is linked because it is linked to planning. I was fortunate enough a couple of years ago to visit Japan. I was in receipt of the Royal Town Planning Institute's George Pepler International Award, and it was also supported by the Japan Foundation as well. And the proposal that I put in, that I got that funding for, was to study Machizukuri, which is roughly translates as community building. But I think Antonia and I had a slight misunderstanding that she wanted to talk about community buildings, and I said, well, I can't really do that, that's not what I've been looking at. But then I thought, no, I'm sure I can, I don't want to turn this opportunity down. And when I actually started to look at it, some of the examples that I'm going to talk about, the buildings are actually really, really crucial parts of these activities. So it's actually helped me look at things in a new way as well, so it's been really good. So that's why I'm here, and I'll just run through a little bit more about what Machizukuri is before I run through some of the examples that I want to show you. And then I'll say what I think these buildings provide for communities, the benefits for the buildings themselves as well, and what this might mean in terms of lessons about how we look at our community buildings. So Machizukuri is a broad, really broad concept actually, an umbrella concept that many people probably here would say is too broad to be of use, but I didn't find that. Community building, community making, creation of communities, it was a term coined in Japan in the 60s and 70s in response to the really rapid economic growth there at the time, and what residents perceived to be the negative environmental and social consequences associated with that, and how centralised it all was. And it's grown, Machizukuri as a concept has grown since then to encompass a whole range of activities, from quite formal involvement in planning by communities, but to a wide range of social and environmental citizens' movements as well. So in that sense, it's got quite similar features to localism, but also there's some specific elements, the preparation of very localised district plans, for example, that's actually really closely linked to neighbourhood planning. So the study I did looked at that was the main 5 things I was seeking to find out about Machizukuri in that list there, but what about the buildings that are involved in those examples? Nagoya is one of the biggest cities in Japan. They have a different sort of classification system of cities, and it's based on population, so even quite small areas that feel really rural can be classed as cities. But Nagoya is very much what we would class as a city as well. They have their own dedicated urban institute, which is a publicly accessible building run by the city government. People can come in, they can use the venue for community activities. There's a really great reference library of urban planning type resources there. And it's also a base for a group of consultants that provide advice to local communities in the similar way that consultants are helping people with neighbourhood plans at the moment here. They also have this great scale model there that you can use, and it's actually a really useful tool. We don't tend to have them so much in this country. I don't think, I certainly don't see very many of them. But in Asia, Southeast Asia particularly, I get the sense that they have these in as many public buildings as they can afford to put them in. But they're a really useful tool, I think, to be able to see the city from that sort of perspective. Also in Nagoya, this is on the right-hand side there is what they call, I don't know why, a community salon. It's a cafe on the ground floor, and then there's community facilities on the upper floors. And this facility is playing a real role in helping to regenerate what's actually quite a down at heel shopping arcade and surrounding residential areas that's not been having the best time since a nearby area of the city was regenerated and westernised. So it's providing a useful facility that's bringing the community together and starting to give them a bit of faith in the community again. I mentioned schools there as well, because with the decline in population in Japan, some city schools as well as rural schools are starting to close. So they're really being quite innovative in finding new uses for the schools, not only in disaster evacuation centres, but also for other community uses as well. I was then fortunate enough, almost by chance, to go to the far west of the country. Kashima is just north of where the earthquake happened in the past week or so. So I'm hoping these buildings are still standing. This was an old samurai property that was restored as a sort of a community initiative that involved everyone from really small school children right through to local architects and academics. And it brought the community together in that way, and there was a whole learning process going on about the heritage elements. It's quite a historic community, and it's now just it's quite a tourist attraction, and people can visit. But it's that sense of having brought the community together and a joint learning process. The building at the bottom there is the same one that was on the very first slide. I should have perhaps highlighted that, but I can go back to it if necessary. But it's an old sake factory that's now being used for regular community events. One of the main objectives for this community was trying to retain the younger population because they're all going off to the bright lights. This was a more rural community, and this was a music event, but they also had local produce for sale, and this is something that's happening quite regularly, and it seems to be working. Quite a number of young people are deciding to stay now in numbers that weren't doing so before. And there's other examples in the town as well of the reuse of vacant shops and factories, particularly looking at multiple uses of buildings. And there's a sort of a movement across Japan now called Machinoeki, which is community stations. So it's reusing buildings that might otherwise go into disrepair for multiple functions, really. So behind where I'm taking the picture from there's a local shop, and then this space is used for arts and crafts, and a sort of a cafe facility as well, and in some sort of a warehouse or factory building. Back to another bigger city that I'm sure most people will have heard of. Kyoto also has a dedicated building right in the city, the Centre for Community Collaboration. It's quasi-autonomous from the local government. It's partly funded by the city government, but partly funded through membership from local community members as well. And they provide a venue, but also practical advice and support to local communities. The lady on the left there next to me is particularly helps local communities out on preparing what they call district plans over there. Their districts are much smaller local areas than our district, but they plan for those areas at that level, district plans, as well as having the higher tiers of planning at city and national level. I said I got mixed up with Machinoeki and Machinoeki before. Machinoeki Community Road Station. Community station, and Machinoeki is road station. Now, again, this is something that's proliferated across Japan now, and continues to do so. They're a purpose-built outlet for local producers of crafts and foods, and they sort of serving the purpose really as what we would say service stations providing here. So they're usually on fairly major routes, road routes. But rather than having your KFCs, your Costas, etc., they're entirely done by a local person runs the cafe. The foods that are on offer are locally produced, and the crafts are from local craftspeople. And it's much more like a market inside, really, and a much nicer feel. They're all unique, they're all different. So it's got that local community benefit, that rural economy element, but it's also got that tourism and just a general, they've always got toilets and things as well, so they still serve that essential function. And they're really popular. These fish are always sold out by lunchtime, I was told. And I don't know if you know the Westmoreland approach, the independent service stations here in the UK. There's one at T-Bane, and more recently opened one at Gloucester. And there's quite close comparisons, I think, with that, and I'm hoping that's going to be my next study. Festivals are very important in Japan. A lot of these things have really close cultural ties, I think, which really form the basis of a lot of Machizukuri activity. It's really closely connected with 1,000 years of culture in Japan. Festivals, very important. We have carnivals. We usually have a different float every year. They keep their floats. Some of them are hundreds of years old, and therefore they need somewhere safe to keep them. So there's a really old example there of a festival float garage, but the one on the right is a much newer one, and that was funded by the again very small city, but it's the city government. But again, rather than just being the festival garage, they had a community meetings facility on there and a small museum that they were charging people to visit that was all about the local festival and the floats. So it's just performing a few different functions rather than just looking at that sole and basic function of the garage. So it's a very quick whiz through of what's actually quite a big topic, but I'm sure that's been the case for everyone today. But to me, these examples show that the buildings and the different ways they're used by communities, they're very much facilitators for and catalysts of community activities. They're not just venues, but they can provide multiple functions, multiple benefits and opportunities for communities, including sometimes generating income. Common ground, it's a neutral meeting point for people who might be from very disparate parts of the community, but common ground also in the sense that it's a building that's in their community and that's shared in itself. And these buildings all have that, a lot of them have cultural and historic connections, or hopefully they'll become buildings that have cultural and historic connections in the future. They're also a concrete element within people's communities, a visible feature that people can cling to, if you like, in that sort of sense of place and feeling what their community is about. And when people come together, for example, to restore the Samurai property, for example, it's a tangible result. It's not just some survey results or something that's a bit theoretical that a lot of people find difficult to get hold of, but it's something physical they can see as a result of the community working together. And let's face it, without community buildings of whatever type, there's so many really important activities that are delivering on so many social and environmental objectives that just wouldn't happen because you need somewhere to meet to discuss these things in the first place. Benefits for the buildings as well. I'll perhaps leave that one out because some of them are fairly obvious and I know I'm short on time, but hopefully community buildings can be more than just a community facility and that there'll be buildings that we value into the future. So I think to me this means we need to think of and value, create and use community buildings in a much more holistic and imaginative way, making the most of the multiple opportunities and multiple uses they've got for not just the communities but for the inherent value of the buildings themselves. There's financial and resource efficiencies in making buildings do more than what they were just necessarily originally intended to do. Some of the examples there had multiple uses within the buildings, and I think on a time when we're closing libraries or post offices, if there's one way of keeping those together, maybe in one building but in a more efficient way than having lots of separate buildings with these facilities in, that's maybe something we could look at using those disused buildings for. And then we've got a land, not a land bank, but some land that we no longer need, or buildings that we no longer need that might be able to fulfil some maybe of the housing objectives that we were talking about earlier. And I think by having community buildings that allow all these activities to take place, there's so many objectives that they're actually contributing to that are just a step on from the really obvious ones. So they let people meet up, but what do those meetings mean for the people? Is it your OAP who only gets out once a week to a lunch club, or is it the single mum who only gets to speak to other adults when she takes her daughter to a play group, or somebody goes to an exercise class? There's a whole range of sustainability objectives that wouldn't be met if these activities couldn't take place. So these buildings really do have more than the bigger than the sum of the parts, I think, and the sustainability objectives that they can help to meet, the livability and the place shaping that they contribute to is all part of the community building that we're trying to achieve. That was quite a whiz through. There's a few resources there about Machizukuri more generally if anyone's interested, not least my own report into the full Machizukuri study that I was fortunate enough to do. That's me. And I'd welcome any questions if anyone's got them when we get round to the chat.
Thank you so much, that's amazing. Thank you.